Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the first session for InterSystems Ready. My name is Kim Koehler. I manage our learning technology stack at InterSystems, and I'm here with Brenna Quirk, who is actually one of our content developers, but also served as the lead developer for our generative AI chatbot, and Jim Breen, who is the director of learning services. So today we're going to talk about the chatbot that we built, which we call AskMe. We're going to talk about its architecture, how we incorporated InterSystems IRIS vector search to make that what it is. Also, a little bit about the data flow, because we've got middleware, vector database, and the LLM on the end. And then we'll talk a little bit about what our vision looks like going forward. Thank you. So, AskMe is a generative AI-powered tool. It answers questions about our products based off of our product documentation, and also can make learning recommendations for our online learning and classroom courses. It's available on our documentation site and also on our online learning site, and generates responses by leveraging InterSystems IRIS vector search, retrieval augmented or RAG architecture, and we leverage OpenAI. So let me give you a look at what that does live. So here's our documentation website, which I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with. On almost, but not quite all yet, of our documentation pages, we have the Ask Me button in the upper right-hand corner. Open that up and can ask anything. So let me ask, what are globals? Great InterSystems question. It'll think for a few minutes, or less than a few minutes. Could not, glabs. Okay, I can't type. There we go. It won't answer questions if it's not based on our stuff. And here you go. It'll give you a relatively concise answer, and as they were talking about in some of the keynotes, let me click out of that, it'll actually provide you the sources that it used to create that answer. So let me minimize this. How did this all get started? Well, about a year ago, Jenny Ames, who's sitting in the back, started playing around with our enterprise ChatGPT account, a couple of external files that had information about our online courses, and then prompt engineering, a lot of prompt engineering to see what could we do? Could we actually get ChatGPT to make course learning recommendations for us? Then over the summer, we had an intern who was able to actually put some of our course information into a vector database and built a React app on top of that as a prototype to see, what does this look like? Could we actually make this into a chatbot that we might be able to use on our own sites? And we also started our user experience group going on some research to see, what do people want? Then last fall and winter, we kicked into high gear and took not only all of our course information into an IRIS vector database, but we had the enormous task of putting all of our documentation information into a vector database. So we were actually able to pull that directly out of Perforce in XML format, stuff that into the vector database, write some Python middleware using embedded Python on top of that to create all of the functionality that we needed, including the APIs, and we started working on our documentation site and our online learning site to create the front ends that we would need for the chatbot. This winter and spring, we've been focusing on adding observability. we have chosen to go down the path of lang views and starting to figure out exactly what analytics we want to pull out of this, which is where all of you come in, because we want you to go and try it afterwards, take it back to your companies and see, is it useful for you? And if it is, tell your friends and coworkers about it. We've also been spending time improving the infrastructure, because this is, of course, a public-facing or customer-facing application for us. So we want to make sure that it's up and ready for you to use 24/7. And our next steps, personalization. So basically being able to allow you to build in or inform the chatbot. What do you look for? What products do you use? What versions of which products do you use? Basically, what do you want out of this? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brenna to talk about the architecture and vector search.
Thank you, Kim. My name is Brenna Quirk. I'm one of the senior technical online course developers in online learning. And as Kim mentioned, I've been acting as the development lead for this project. So I want to start by talking about the architecture of this chatbot. So at a very high level, we have our front end, which you can see on the left here. And we have actually two InterSystems IRIS instances on the back end. One of these hosts the Python middleware that Kim mentioned, and the other one is our primary vector database. This could easily be within the same instance, but we chose to do it this way so that the vector database can act as kind of a company-wide resource, so people can plug and play and really start to use that vector search capability beyond just this project. And then, as Kim mentioned, we interface with OpenAI, so that is the large language model that we use on the back end to generate responses to questions. And just to level the playing field here a little bit, I want to give a quick overview of retrieval augmented generation, in case you haven't heard this. So basically, when a question comes in, it goes through our Python middleware, and we run a vector similarity search to retrieve documents from our vector storage that are similar to the question that came in. And so this lets us add these sources to our prompt that we're sending to OpenAI to give a little bit more background and context. And so then OpenAI can use these sources when it's coming up with the answer to the question. And then we send that back to the user on the front end. So we chose to make this an API-driven framework. So as Kim mentioned, this lives on our documentation site and on our online learning site. And in order to make it very easy to pop this chatbot into the different front ends, we designed these API endpoints that can be called from different areas of the front end. So when you load the window, that calls one of our endpoints to get your chat started. If you click that little refresh button to start a new chat, that calls another endpoint. Our main endpoint with most of the logic is the chatbot one. So every time you send a query, we're calling that endpoint. And then when you use the feedback buttons, so if you get a response and it's really great, you give it a thumbs up. We encourage you to do that. Or if it's bad, you can give it a thumbs down. But hopefully it'll be great. And so this way we are able to have the different front ends, which are built by different people, but it all calls the same back end, so very easy to use it in those different areas. So we have two different types of data stored in our vector storage. The primary, or the larger one, I would say, is our product documentation. This is what is used to answer any product questions that people send in. So this is pulled directly from our source control from Perforce in XML format, and then we do some parsing and cleanup. So for example, in this lower screenshot, you can see a lot of pages in our documentation have a See Also section, which is great if you are perusing documentation to find other things, but that's not going to be super good for adding context when we're trying to get an answer to a question. So we remove that before we actually vectorize all of this data. And we have these chunked out into sections within the page. So each of those sections outlined with blue would be embedded as one vector in our vector storage. And we have over 123,000 chunks like this across all of our product documentation. And then we also, for learning recommendations, we have all of our online learning and our classroom courses vectorized. So this is a bit of a different ingestion process. For this one, rather than XML, we have a CSV file that contains the course metadata, and these are chunked just by course. So I have an example up on screen here of what that metadata looks like for one of our courses. So it's like the title, the description, and information about the content type, the level, whether it's introductory or more of an advanced resource. And in this database, we have over 550 online courses with 7 metadata elements for each of them. And we have all 14 of the classroom courses that we offer with 6 metadata elements for each of those. So that's a lot of stuff that we have vectorized for this. And as we have gone through this process, there are some best practices and lessons learned specific to vector search and vector storage that I'd like to share. So number 1 is use clean, purposeful input. So I mentioned this earlier, but there can be a lot of kind of junk in the data that you're putting in. So you want to make sure that before you create your whole vector database, you remove anything that is not going to be useful, like those see also sections that I mentioned. You might end up with empty chunks, like white space that's not going to be useful, or things like just a standalone heading. So if I was vectorizing my content and one chunk said InterSystems IRIS for health, that's not going to be very useful when you're trying to come up with answers. So try to avoid things like that. Something else useful in terms of processing the data before vectorizing it is we realize that adding tags into our data can be very useful. So if you think about like a page in documentation that has a code snippet, when you're reading it, it's very obvious to you, okay, I'm reading the introduction, now I'm looking at the code, and then I'm reading a little bit more information. But without kind of the format of the documentation page, it's going to be harder for that large language model to parse what part of this is code and what part of this is just informational text. So we added in little tags that say like code begins and code ends, so that when we pass these sources to the large language model, it has that bit of context to be able to use it better. The second one is to think about your chunking strategy. So I mentioned that we have each chunk for documentation is equal to 1 section on the page, and for our courses, it's 1 course is 1 chunk. But this is something that you can experiment with. You might, depending on your use case, find it more useful to have very small chunks, or if you think that you're going to need a lot of context, maybe to answer broader questions, you might want larger chunks. You can also experiment with overlap between the chunks. So for example, if you have 2 sections that are related to each other, you might want to include a little bit of the end of one with the beginning of the other, and vice versa. And another idea is that you can actually retrieve small chunks from your vector database. So when you run that vector search, maybe your chunks are only a paragraph long, but that doesn't mean that you have to send only that paragraph along to the large language model. So maybe you use a vector search to find the most relevant paragraph, but you want to send the context of that whole page of documentation. So you can do that as well. Another important one is to optimize your metadata. So this came up for us when we were looking at the courses, which have a lot of metadata, as I mentioned. So if you're finding that you're filtering on your metadata frequently, consider indexing your columns. Vector search is InterSystems SQL. Indexes are very helpful. They can make your searches much more efficient. And you can also consider pulling out any JSON metadata into columns. So for example, we have our courses sorted depending on whether they are publicly available or health share only. And so we needed to be able to filter on that. And we had it in a JSON metadata column. And we found it's going to be much easier to search on that and add indexes if we just pull that out into a separate column. So when you run a vector search, it'll return not only the chunk of information, but it also gives you a similarity score. So this tells you how similar is this chunk of data that I found to whatever query I was running it against. And so it's important to review these similarity scores, which can help you adjust your vector search. If you're getting very bad scores, maybe you need to rethink your chunking strategy. And you can also set thresholds on that similarity score to avoid returning any irrelevant data. So if, for example, you run a vector search and every time it returns like 2 pieces of data with a very high score and everything else is lower, maybe you just set your threshold so that you only ever pull those top 2. And finally, it's kind of an art, not a science. So try things out, test iteratively, and when you are pulling these sources, if something doesn't make sense to you, it's not going to make sense to the large language model. So really, when you run a vector search in this RAG context, it's to give more information to the large language model to answer the question. So you want to make sure that it's going to make sense. All right, so that's all the vector search stuff. Now, if you remember at the beginning, I showed we actually have a second IRIS instance that is the middleware. So let's talk about that one next. So there are 2 primary purposes to this IRIS instance in our architecture. First up is hosting the middleware. So this is a Python WSGI application. It's actually written with Flask to define those API endpoints that I mentioned earlier. So this IRIS instance hosts the app, it serves those API endpoints, and it contains all of the logic that routes our data through that RAG workflow that we looked at. We also store information on this IRIS instance. So every query that comes through the chatbot, we store like any chat session metadata, so like conversation history, any feedback responses that people give on the responses from the chatbot. And this is just an example of what one of those looks like in our database. All right, so now we're going to get into the fun part, looking at the data flow through our chatbot. So I have this kind of complicated graphic, and to go through it, I'm going to show you an example. So say that you have opened up AskMe and you were chatting with it and you were asking, what is a fire server? How do I start getting set up with a fire server? And you realize, I actually need to learn more about this. Is there any learning content about this? If we just sent this question to run a vector search against our sources, it's not going to return anything useful. Everything in our courses that we have stored is learning content. So it doesn't know what you're talking about. So the first thing that we actually do every time a query comes in is we create what we call a contextualized query, which takes into account the previous conversation. So we send the query along with the chat summary previous exchanges to OpenAI. We say, turn this into a query, a contextualized query, and then it returns something like, is there any educational material available for learning how to set up and manage a fire server? So that's a lot more context. That's going to get a better response. Now we have those 2 different data sources that are used for different things. And so we want to know which of those data sources to run our vector search against. And rather than try to write logic that's going to decide, we just use OpenAI. So every query that comes in, we send it to OpenAI, and we say, is this a learning recommender query, or is this more of an ask anything type of query? And so in this case, it's learning recommender. So then we can run our vector search against the course metadata database. It'll return some of those sources, and then we can build the prompt to get us our final response to the question. So we'll put together the question that the user sent in, the sources that we pulled from the vector database using our vector similarity search, and the history of the conversation to give a little bit more context, as well as instructions telling the large language model what to do with this information. So we make our final call to OpenAI, and it tells us, here's a recommended learning path, and it'll give you a list of resources, and that gets sent back to the user. There's actually one more prompt/LLM call to OpenAI on this graph that I didn't cover yet, right in the middle in the bottom here. So I mentioned that we use the previous exchanges and the chat history to add context, but if the conversation starts getting long, that's going to add a lot to our prompt. It's going to add up in tokens. And so after about 3 or 4 back and forths with the user, we actually start summarizing that into a concise couple sentences that describes what the conversation has been about. So that is a call that happens to OpenAI as well. So you think RAG, you might think it's just one call to OpenAI to get an answer, but we actually have 4 different queries. And so for all of these queries, there is prompt engineering that goes into it. So we use prompting first to route to the different modules, decide whether this person wants a learning recommendation or they just want an answer. We use it to create that contextualized query that takes into account the history of the conversation so far. We use it to summarize the conversation, which we can then use when the conversation starts getting long. And finally, we use it to get a response to the user query. One of these that I want to look a little bit closer at and just show you the code is the routing. This is kind of a use case that I hadn't seen before with LLMs before working on this project, which is using something called structured output. So in this case, when we make the call to the large language model, we actually limit it to only respond with the names of one of our modules. So it kind of gives us a variable that we can continue using in our code, and we know it's going to be one of these 2 values. So that's an interesting and new way to use it. All right, so we talked about best practices for the vector storage and vector search side. Prompt engineering is the other big part of this all, so I want to tell you about some of the best practices and lessons learned from our project for prompting. First one is that the structure matters, and I think this one's kind of intuitive. If you think about someone gives you a handout and it's just one really long block of text, it's going to be kind of hard to parse through and hard to read. But if it is well formatted, if they have headings and paragraphs and white space, it's going to be a lot easier to parse. So you want to use that same kind of structure in your prompts that you're sending to the large language model. You can use things like bulleted lists, numbers, use asterisks for emphasis on important instructions. Basically, large language models parse relatively similarly to how we do as humans. So this goes back to, I mentioned this in the vector search best practices as well, but if it doesn't make sense to you or if it's hard to parse for you, it will be difficult for the large language model. Next one is to be specific with your expectations. And one really easy way to do this is to just give an example. So every time we ask for a learning recommendation from the large language model, we give it an example of what that might look like in terms of the desired output style and format. And you can also help frame the task. This is a very common, if you've worked with ChatGPT, you've probably done this, but you can instruct the large language model on how to act. So for example, saying, you are a helpful learning assistant. You're trying to help this person create a training program. And finally, you can use the prompt to guard against issues. So adding in guardrails to be clear about anything that should not be answered. And Kim demonstrated this for us wonderfully earlier. If it doesn't know the answer, if it's not something about InterSystems products, it will let you know. It won't try to answer, and that reduces the risk of hallucinations as well. And also, when you are building these prompts through code, you're probably going to be inserting variables in. And so just something to keep in mind is that you want to make sure that any variables that get inserted are cleaned up. So like special characters, things like curly braces, percent, whatever, can be interpreted differently by the large language model. So just understand what you're putting in and clean it up if you need to. And finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about the observability that Kim mentioned that we are putting into practice, so using LangFuse. So where's my mouse? There it is. This is the question that I gave the example of when we looked at the data flow, where I said, is there any learning content about this? And LangFuse lets us see what is actually going on behind the scenes for every step. So this is creating the contextualized query. You can see the prompt, you can see the outcome, and then when we're routing to the module, you can see again the same prompt, the question that goes in. You can see the vector search, the actual results that it returned, the similarity scores that each of these has, and then finally you can look at the prompt that puts everything together, so the query, the sources, the chat history, the instructions, and see the final response that comes through. So this is great as you're testing. You can look, if you're not getting quite the right response that you want, you can look into each step of the process of the data flow and see where you might need to tweak things to improve it. So just wanted to give a quick look at that. And at the end of the day, AskMe is mostly embedded Python. So I know it can be intimidating if you think, oh, I want to do this with Iris, but I'm not an ObjectScript developer. You don't really have to be. You can take advantage of the vector search capabilities without needing to be an ObjectScript expert. So that's all on kind of the back end here, and I would like to hand it over to Jim Breen now to talk about the vision for this project.
Thank you, Brenna. So again, my name is Jim Breen, and I am the Global Director of Learning for InterSystems. So my first question to all of you folks is, how many of you have tried AskMe? If you could just raise your hands. Okay, hopefully the room will all raise their hands by the end of the conference. You'll have a chance to drive it. So you've heard a lot about what happens under the covers, and I'm gonna bring you up to like 30,000 foot view. Is like, so why did we do it? Like, what was the vision? So it was actually this time last year that I started thinking about, so where are we gonna go with learning? Like, we have a lot of great resources, documentation, online learning, classroom training, certification. Well, what's next? And for me, it was, we have so much, but it's hard to find, or people don't know where to start with their learning. How do they get what they want as quickly as they want it or need it? And sometimes it's just answers, to a problem that you have. And I was thinking, man, wouldn't it be great if you could just go in and find what you needed as quickly as possible? And that's when I came up with personalization. So personalized learning, but what I would say is hyper-personalized learning. So we're really in the first phase of our AskMe chatbot Gen AI. It's going to continue because we want it to become more hyper-personalized. And you might be saying, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to have personalized learning? So I'm going to go through a few of the things. So the first is context aware. Like, wouldn't it be great, you come into our chatbot, you go to AskMe, and it remembers. So you start a conversation, and maybe you're a Python developer, and you ask questions about Python. Like, how do I do Python with Iris, that kind of thing. And not only does it give you an answer, but it continues to stay in that context. So you don't have to re-ask and say, oh, I'm asking about Python again, but I'm asking this. It's going to remember. Like a lot of chatbots, you ask a question, you get an answer, and that's the end. We want it to be much more conversational, just like you were talking to a trainer or maybe someone from documentation. So it always remembers the context that you're in. Secondly, preference-based adaptation. So like, well, what is that? An analogy that I use is like driving a car. So when you get in a car, you can adjust the mirror, you can adjust the seats so that you're comfortable. You really control where you go. You control how fast you go. You decide if you want to go left or right, or if you want to bang a U-turn. You decide pretty much everything. We want this experience with our chatbot to be the same. So we want you to be able to personalize it and say, yeah, I like visual learning, or maybe I don't. I would just rather read context, or I like videos. Or I like to go very fast. I don't like a slow response. Or I like to go slow. And I like to learn everything, or I like to go specific. So what we want to do, and we're working on that with personalization or hyper-personalization, to make it specific to you. So that's what we mean by preference-based adaptation. Just like getting in a car, you sort of make it your own. And you decide where you go and how fast. Same thing with learning. The next one is data-driven suggestions. So we're collecting a lot of data in order to help you better. So once the chatbot starts answering questions, it'll remember things about you. Like, we want to collect information like, are you a customer? Are you a potential customer? Are you a Python developer? Are you ObjectScript developer? This information we want it to remember. So when you come back, like in a day, an hour, a week, it's going to be like, oh, hey, Jim, welcome back. Last time you were here, you were working on this. Do you want to continue with this, or do you want to go somewhere else? So it remembers that. It's data-driven. So we keep all that. And the data that we'll collect is like, what do people want? So how can we make this even better, like more personalized, like really hyper-personalized to you? So we're collecting data on the back end, but we're also giving you experience on the front end. The next one is cross-platform integration. Isn't it awful like if you're one part of a website and it's working great, but then you go to another part of the website and you feel like you have to start all over again, like if you're using chats? Not the experience for us. Like, we want your experience to be the same no matter where you go. Like if you're in documentation, if you're online learning, if you go to certification, that it remembers who you are, what you're trying to do, and what information you're trying to get out of it. And eventually, I'm hoping that's the same experience across the entire InterSystems website. So we're working on that to make that hyper-personalized. So that's cross-platform. And then targeted recommendations. So this is like the Amazon, model. Oh, you've read this book, you might like this one. So for us, it will be part of the personalized learning is where we have the learning recommender. So we know who you are, and we can recommend like a learning path. Like, we can design a specific custom learning path for you. And that's what this would do. It's like, oh, you've learned this, perhaps you would like to learn this. Or would you like to continue on in your journey about IRIS? Or are you preparing for a certification exam? Oh, what is the exam in? Okay, well, this would be the next thing in your learning journey. So it's going to be recommending things that you want. But you can say no, and you can say, no, I want to go a completely different way. I want to learn about something else, another part of our technology. Or maybe you just have a problem and you want an answer really quickly from our documentation. And it'll give you that too, and it gives you the source from where it came from, so you can check it. So those are what we mean. That's sort of the big vision, of hyper-personalization. I'd say we're sort of on the personalization mode now, but we're going to get there. So next year, hopefully, you'll be here and you'll see a hyper-personalization. One of the cool things about this was, it came about this time last year is when we first came up with the idea. And we did it within our team. Like, we didn't go to any outside resources, and their full-time jobs are not like developing this chatbot, the Gen AI chatbot. And we decided, well, what kind of talent do we have on our teams? Oh, we have some development, we have a project manager, we have a product owner. So we just created a team. It was sort of a little extracurricular on top of the regular jobs, that we used our own, software. We used IRIS, and we were able to create it. So everybody here, feel free, ask questions. You can do this yourself, and you don't have to go to like outside resources. Okay, like I said, you're all going to have an opportunity to try the AskMe chatbot. Out in the hallway here, at the end of the hallway, you'll see a kiosk, and on both sides there are laptops and screens. So that's the AskMe Try It. So we encourage you to go to the kiosk and try it. And if you do, you become, if you'd like, a fan club, so you'll get a button as a fan club, or AskMe fan club. And then we're also in the Tech Exchange, like Learning Services has a table here. So just a plug for the other things we do. So all the different areas, certification, online, classroom. You can sign up for personal training. Like, if you want to learn something, we can assign a trainer to you to spend like an hour or so to go over something. If you'd like to sign up for an exam, or how to prep for an exam, or if you had trouble with an exam, we can coach you through that. If you're looking for specific learning, or maybe you're interested in learning something in online in the future, maybe not the next few days, you can work with some of our trainers to actually put together a plan for you for learning. So please come visit us. We're also doing some surveys. We'd like to hear from you of like what you would like to see from our documentation site. How does it work for you? What kind of things that we can do to improve what we're doing? We're always trying to make it better for you. So we want to be able to provide you with what you need, when you need, as quickly as you can get it. All right. And then last but not least is questions. So here's an opportunity for you to ask questions about the work that we put into AskMe, or anything else you'd like to ask us. So we're just going to do a panel here. Yeah. Kim, do you want to lead this?
Okay, so the question was, how many person hours have we put into the project so far? That's a good question.
It's really varied over, other projects and things we're trying to do with releases. But on average, would you say in a week would you?
I would say during like the real push on development for this, it was about 50% of my time, so like 20 hours a week, and then we had a team of 4 or 5 developers working on it, putting in around that or a little less.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they were all 20 hours. I think you
Yeah,
were,
no, I was going to say,
so
I think I did a little bit more, but I would say there were about 4 months where it was a very strong push, yeah.
And then add probably about 10 hours a week, project management, direction.
And we pushed it out pretty quickly. We came up with the idea last year on June, July, and we started really launching by the end of the year. So, yes.
Down front. Okay, so the first question is the framework available for use in your own applications? We had not considered that.
Well, again, InterSystems' goal is to make the application partner successful. This would add to it. So I'm just asking the question.
I know we can certainly look into that. We hadn't even thought of that.
Yeah, sure, we'd be able to do that. Even just sharing what we shared here today, happy to work with you.
I'm not looking to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
I'm looking to draw from somebody that's already been here.
Great. And the second question, and this is really for the recording, that's why we're repeating the questions, is, do we hope to port this over to our WRC, the Worldwide Response Center for our support division? We are currently doing that with other teams. So other folks are working on other Gen AI chatbots or response bots. But eventually we would like to all be together so that you have that common experience when you're on our website to be able to get what you need as quickly as possible. We're also doing, working with some Gen AI for our support advisors to be able to really search through all the problems that have come in over the years to be able to find out, oh, is this a similar problem to, that this company might have had like 5 years ago or another company has, so that we can respond to you much more quickly.
That's what you're doing now when you get support. So
Yep.
it'd be nice if you could do self-help. Saying,
Yep.
when you get stuck, and so you can come back and now ask for a seasoned answer.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think it's great.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I think that is one of the long-term goals, is to be able to make it self-help for customers who want that.
I think we're finding people using the documentation, like using AskMe, to get answers really quickly in documentation to solve problems. Some of our support advisors are as well. So. I think there's a question.
Yeah, with the personalization of content that you have on individuals, you went through the circle there.
Yes. Yes.
With that content, is that stored in a local LLM, or where does that reside? Where's the repository?
I can take this one.
Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, where's the information about the user being stored, the personalization piece? And right now, all we are doing is basically storing chat history. So currently, we do not have, we aren't able to identify users in any way. We just identify a chat session and the questions and responses back and forth within that chat session. And we use that to take a look at our, what's the word I'm looking for? How well we're doing. Eventually, we do expect to have a login concept, should you choose to do so. And then that information would be stored basically in our middleware.
Yeah, in IRIS.
It would be local. So when you start collecting that data, which we will, we got to make sure that it's secure so that no one can break into it.
And one last question, the vector search information, do you have any, like a pictorial of that, what that might look like? An example? I know it can get a little convoluted in what it looks like, but maybe try and give some ideas of why it's important, how it makes the process of getting an answer a lot more accurate.
So the question is, do we have an example, a graphic, an image, information about how the vector search works?
Yeah, I don't think off the top of my head I do, but to give kind of a example of what makes it good, or what about it is useful, is like if you go to the documentation website and you type something in the search bar and look at the sources that you get, and then try asking AskMe and look at the sources that returns, I can almost guarantee you it's going to be more relevant resources returned through AskMe, and that's because that is that vector similarity search that's working in the background.
In the back.
The question is, are we planning to add a chat history feature, like storing chats? Yeah, I think that once we are able to identify users, like Kim mentioned, once we have like a login and the concept of like a user profile, at that point we will be able to persist your chat sessions.
Sorry, I'm planning for that poll. I'm going to ask us, do we put a few polls to open my AI? So if you want to do that poll question in the service account, summarize it. Is there any advice or concerns from that point of view?
So best practices for summarizing chats.
So I'm not going to use the chats. I'm going to take all the patient details with that and there's a marketing sense. You want to summarize it in like a bigger view. For the doctors to, physically view what happened in the course. Yeah.
So summarizing a large data set.
I guess patient privacy is a big concern. Why about sending data an AI?
Yeah. For us, I don't know that we have a good answer for you, but if you hang out, the very last slide lists 6 other sessions that have to do with generative AI, some of them to do with our TrackCare and IntelliCare products, which very well should answer that question for you. Oh, sorry.
Consider the ability to email the result from your chat when you're all done.
So the question was, have we considered the ability to email the result of your chat? And I don't think we have, but I'm going to write it down.
Yeah, great idea. Thank you.
And we have one question over here. I'll come back.
You mentioned earlier that you consume, I think, all the documentation. I presume that's all from Document. Are you also consuming the reference documentation?
We are not yet consuming the class reference documentation. That was the question. But it's something that in conversations I've had with a lot of people, there's a lot of interest in it. And it's something that we've put on our roadmap because we think it will really improve answers relating to code.
And
You mentioned the whole chat history. Like how many days worth of chat history and how we are managing the memory on
the question is how much chat history are we actually keeping track of?
So currently all chat history is persisted in our database, but it is tied to a session and we reset sessions once a day. So if you are having a chat with AskMe and then you come back the next day, your chat history won't be there. Once we get that concept of a login, we'll be able to persist it from day to day. But we have all the information on the back end. It's just like from a user perspective, your chat history won't stay there for more than a day at this point.
Yes, sorry.
So the question is, do we use the chat history to train the model? We don't train, so the large language model is just through OpenAI. What we use the chat history for is, I would say 2 primary use cases. One is to give context to the query. So the example I showed where I asked, do you have learning content about this? So we use the chat history to turn that into a question that's like, do you have learning content about this specific topic that we were talking about? And we also use it when we do the call to OpenAI to get the final response. So it's part of the prompt that we send to OpenAI. So the question is, it does more data that you put in make it more accurate? And I think that it varies. There's definitely a sweet spot where if you provide too much information, it can, confuse it a little bit. Yeah, I think we haven't, like at our current point, we aren't reaching the point where we're putting in too much data that it's like bringing down the responses. I think that, this is also like why after a certain number of back and forths, we summarize the chat instead of sending the actual like responses and questions that came in, because that can just get to be too much. And like if you're talking about different topics throughout the chat history, a summary that's like 1 or 2 sentences will keep it more on track.
I think natively, you always have to make sure that your data is clean, like having clean data. That it's huge when it comes to using chat.
Well, we'd like to thank you for coming. We are at the end of our time. However, Brenna and I will both be at the Learning Services table in the Tech Exchange. And as we mentioned, we do have the Try AskMe kiosk just down the hall here on the right. So last few things. 1, the end of every presentation, we'll give you the prompt to join our early access program. So if you're interested in trying out the latest and greatest from InterSystems, please feel free. And for those of you who are playing along in the Cvent app and want points, every time you do a survey for one of our presentations, you get points. So we would love to know what you thought about this one. And if you have any feedback, any ideas, let us know. And as promised, if you are interested in other aspects of using generative AI within your own applications, these are some, but not all, of the presentations that you could visit. The very first one, Inside Vector Search Technical Innovations in InterSystems IRIS, I believe starts at 2:30 today, so in about 18 minutes. Thank you all very much. We'll look forward to seeing you in Learning Services, at the Learning Services